What do you do when the man whose truck you just mocked in front of his daughter turns out to own the ground your car is parked on? That's not a riddle. That's exactly what happened to Diane Whitfield on a Thursday morning outside a strip of small businesses on the edge of a city she'd come to quietly take apart, one parcel at a time. Diane Whitfield ran Whitfield Regional, a holding company with 43 commercial properties and a 44th she'd flown in personally to finalize. Because the kind of consolidation she was attempting required a face people would remember saying no to. She had a black town car idling at the curb, an assistant 3 steps behind her at all times. And absolutely no idea that the man loading boxes into a rust-spotted pickup 6 feet away held the one deed her entire acquisition plan depended on. Marcus Webb had built a small hardware and lumber supply out of a single rented bay 11 years earlier, after his wife passed and left him with a 6-year-old daughter, and a mortgage he couldn't carry on a warehouse salary alone. He'd bought the lot beneath that strip of businesses 2 years later, when nobody else wanted it. With money he'd saved one paycheck at a time specifically so no landlord could ever again tell him what his rent would be next year. He kept his head down most mornings, and it wasn't humility. It was just a man who'd learned that the people who needed to know what he owned would find out eventually, and the people who didn't need to know weren't owed an explanation. Stay with this one. Because what starts as one careless comment in a parking lot on a Thursday morning is going to end with an entire city watching a woman learn exactly who she was talking to and by the time it's over, you're going to understand why some men never feel the need to correct you the first time you're wrong about them. Diane had come to that strip of businesses to look, in person, one final time at the parcel her legal team had spent 4 months trying to acquire through every channel that didn't involve actually meeting the man who owned it. The 11-unit retail strip sat on a half-acre that Whitfield Regional needed to complete a redevelopment footprint worth, on paper, considerably more than the going rate anyone had offered for it. Every offer had been declined, politely, briefly, without negotiation. Diane had decided, against the advice of her own counsel, that a personal visit might succeed where 6 months of correspondence hadn't. She arrived to find the parking lot half full, a hardware delivery truck blocking one lane, and an old pickup minus primer gray in patches. A dent in the tailgate that had clearly been there for years minus parked crookedly across 2 spaces near the entrance. A man in a faded work jacket was loading boxes of plumbing fixtures into the bed, while a girl of about 10 sat on the open tailgate, swinging her legs, narrating something to her father that he was only half listening to. Diane's driver had to idle behind the pickup for nearly a full minute waiting for a space to clear, and something about the wait. On a morning already loaded with the particular tension of a deal that wasn't going her way, let the wrong sentence out of her before she'd thought better of it. She rolled her window down as she finally pulled past. "You'd think a truck that's seen better decades could at least learn to park inside the lines," she said, not quite under her breath, loud enough to carry. Marcus didn't look up right away. He set the last box down in the truck bed, latched the tailgate gently around his daughter's legs, and only then turned toward the voice. "It parks fine," he said. "It's also parked on my lot, so I figure that buys it some grace." Diane, halfway out of her own car by then, paused with one hand on the door. "Your lot." "All 11 units, Marcus said, "lot included." He said it the way you'd mention the weather. No weight behind it, no performance. He glanced at his daughter, who'd gone very quiet and very interested in the exchange. "You're here about the redevelopment offer. I'm guessing your firm's called 4 times this month." Diane's assistant, 3 steps behind her, had gone very still in the specific way assistants go still when they realize their employer has just walked into something they didn't fully prepare her for. "Stay with me here, because the next 20 minutes are going to teach Diane Whitfield something about due diligence that 4 months of legal correspondence apparently never covered." "You're Marcus Webb," Diane said. It wasn't quite a question by the time it left her mouth. "I am," he said. "And you're Diane Whitfield. I've seen the letterhead enough times to recognize it without looking." His daughter, perched on the tailgate, watched the exchange with the open, unhurried curiosity of a child who has learned that adults sometimes say interesting things, right in front of you if you stay quiet long enough. "Dad," she said eventually, Is this the lady who keeps sending the letters you put in the drawer? Marcus almost smiled. That's her, Ellie. Diane felt something she rarely felt in a negotiation, the floor shifting slightly beneath a position she'd thought was solid. You've declined 6 offers, she said. Each one above the last. I have. Marcus said. May I ask why? He considered the question with the same unhurried economy he'd used to latch the tailgate. Because the number was never the problem, he said. You're not just asking me to sell a parking lot, Ms. Whitfield. You're asking me to sell 11 businesses their rent floor. I keep it fair on purpose. Whatever buys this lot next won't. Diane looked past him at the strip of storefronts, minus a tailor, a small diner, a shoe repair shop, a flower stand. His own hardware supply at the end minus each one with hand-lettered signs and the particular, lived-in clutter of small businesses that had been there long. Enough to matter to the people who used them. That's admirable, she said, and meant it more than she expected to when the words left her mouth. It's also not how a parcel this size usually gets evaluated. I know how it usually gets evaluated. Marcus said, I used to work for a company that evaluated lots exactly that way. I know what happens to the diner and the tailor, 6 months after a deal like yours closes. He latched the truck's rear gate fully now, the conversation apparently reaching its natural endpoint for him. I'm not interested in being the reason 11 families lose their rent floor so a property line on a spreadsheet looks cleaner. T1. Don't look away yet. Because what Diane does over the next several days, minus what she chooses to actually look into before making her next move minus, is the part of this story that surprises even her own team. Diane did not leave the city that afternoon as planned. She told her assistant to clear the following 2 days, which had, been, never once happened on an acquisition trip in the 6 years she'd run Whitfield Regional, and she spent those 2 days doing something her own due diligence team apparently hadn't thought necessary. She walked the strip herself, talked to the tenants directly, and asked each of them, without an agenda visible in her voice, how long they'd been there and what their rent actually was. The tailor, a woman named Rosa, who'd had her shop in Unit 4 for 9 years, told her Marcus had only raised her rent twice in that entire span, both times by less than the rate of inflation, and that he'd quietly waived 2 months entirely the year her husband was sick. The diner owner told her Marcus fixed the walk-in cooler himself, for free, because a contractor's quote had been more than the diner's monthly margin could survive. The shoe repair shop owner, an older man who barely looked up from his bench, said simply Marcus doesn't own a parking lot. He owns the only thing keeping half of us in business, and went back to his work. By the second evening, Diane sat in her hotel room with a legal pad covered in numbers that no longer told the story she'd flown in to confirm. She thought about her own father, who'd built the first iteration of Whitfield Regional out of 3 strip malls and a mortgage he'd personally co-signed. Back when the company's entire philosophy had been that a property was only as valuable as the businesses thriving inside it. She thought about how many acquisitions ago that philosophy had quietly stopped showing up in any internal memo, replaced by a spreadsheet logic that measured square footage and projected rent ceilings, and never once asked what currently sat inside the lines. Stay with me, because someone inside Diane's own company had already decided this deal would close no matter what Diane found out minus, and he'd made that decision before she ever got on the plane. Whitfield Regional's Senior Vice President of Acquisitions, a man named Carter Voss, had spent 4 years building a reputation for closing difficult parcels through whatever pressure produced results fastest. A reputation he protected by keeping the unpleasant mechanics of his deals far enough from Diane's desk that she rarely saw them in detail. When the 6 polite refusals from Marcus Webb hadn't moved the deal, Carter had quietly begun a second track, pressuring the strip's other tenant suppliers, flagging zoning code violations with the city that hadn't been enforced in a decade, and floating through a contact at the local paper an unflattering and only loosely accurate story about blight conditions on the property that conveniently never mentioned who owned it. Carter had not told Diane about any of it, because he'd learned, across 4 years, that Diane preferred not knowing the mechanics as long as the parcel eventually closed. He had assumed her personal visit was simply impatience, a CEO wanting to apply her own pressure in person. He had not anticipated that she might actually talk to the tenants, or that talking to them might change anything at all in her calculus, because in Carter's experience, it never had before. On the third morning, Diane called Carter directly, standing on the sidewalk outside Rose's tailor shop. "I need you to tell me exactly what's been done to move this deal in the last 4 months, she said. "Everything. Not the summary version." Carter's voice on the phone carried the smooth, practiced calm of a man who'd rehearsed exactly this kind of question many times before. "Diane, with respect, you don't usually want the granular detail on a parcel this size. I've been handling the pressure points so you don't have to. That's the job. I'm asking for the detail now." "There is a zoning referral in progress," Carter said, choosing his words the way a man chooses footing on ice. "Standard code enforcement. And there has been some local press interest in the property's condition, which frankly works in our favor minus it builds public pressure for redevelopment. I'd be careful about second-guessing tactics that are actually working, Diane. The board's watching this parcel closely. A sudden change in approach this late could read as inconsistency, and inconsistency is exactly what makes people start asking whether you're still the right person steering this company." It was Diane would recognize within the hour, an almost perfect specimen of the genre, manufactured pressure dressed up as standard procedure, and her own judgment quietly recast as the risk, rather than the tactics he'd hidden from her for months. "Stop all of it," Diane said. "The zoning referral, the press contact, all of it today. Diane, I don't think you understand how close." "I understand exactly how close," Diane said. "Stop it today, Carter." She hung up before he could arrange a response, and stood for a long moment outside Rose's shop, looking at a hand-painted sign that had clearly been touched up more than once over 9 years rather than replaced, and feeling for the first time in longer than she could comfortably admit, genuinely uncertain whether the company her father built still resembled anything he'd recognize. "Stay with me, because Carter doesn't simply stop minus and what he does instead, in the next 48 hours, brings the whole thing into the open in front of more people than either of them expects." Carter did not stop. He had 4 years of deals riding on a reputation. He couldn't just let it go. For delivering, a bonus structure tied directly to closed acquisitions, and a private conviction that Diane's sudden sentimentality would pass the moment she got back on a plane and back to a desk, with 42 other properties demanding attention. He pushed the zoning referral through an expedited channel he had a personal relationship with at the city planning office, timing it deliberately for a Friday morning when he calculated Diane would already be airborne. What Carter did not anticipate was that the zoning inspector assigned to the case would choose to conduct the walkthrough in person, publicly on a Friday morning when the strip's lot was at its busiest minus, and that Diane, delayed by a flight change, would still be standing in that same lot when the inspector arrived with a clipboard and a folder citing violations that hadn't been flagged in 10 years of the property's existence. Marcus came out of his shop to find a small crowd already gathering minus Rosa from the tailor diner owner wiping his hands on his apron, the shoe repair man standing in his doorway, half a dozen customers, who'd simply stopped to watch a parking lot suddenly fill with a city vehicle and a man with a clipboard. Marcus's daughter Ellie stood beside him, her hand finding his without either of them looking down to confirm it. "There a problem?" Marcus asked the inspector, calm the way he handled most things. The inspector, visibly uncomfortable, read from the citation. "Structural concerns. Drainage non-compliance. Signage violations dating back years that no prior inspector had ever once raised. I received a formal complaint," he said, "filed yesterday. From Whitfield Regional." The crowd's attention shifted, almost as one, toward Diane, standing near her town car with her phone still in her hand, mid-call to her own assistant about the flight delay, utterly unaware until that exact second that the name attached to the complaint was hers. "I didn't file that," Diane said, and her voice carried farther across the lot than she'd intended it to. "I told my SVP to stop that referral 2 days ago. When it came through under your company's name yesterday morning," the inspector said, checking the folder, filed by a Carter Voss, citing executive authorization. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 60 seconds in front of everyone in that parking lot is the moment this story actually turns. Diane's phone was already in her hand. She didn't move toward privacy. Didn't step away from the crowd, the way every instinct from 6 years of careful public relations would normally have told her to. She called Carter directly on speaker, in front of the inspector, in front of Rosa, and the diner owner and Marcus and his daughter, and a dozen strangers who'd simply stopped to see what the commotion was. Carter picked up on the third ring. Diane, hey, listen, I was going to call you. You filed the zoning complaint under executive authorization, Diane said. After I told you to stop it in front of the property owner, his daughter, and roughly a dozen witnesses. A pause on the line, the particular silence of a man recalculating in real time with no good angle left to recalculate toward. I thought it had already cleared the system before your call came through, Carter said. I didn't think it mattered to pull it at that point. It's a standard process, Diane. This happens on every parcel you used my name and my authority to manufacture a violation history that doesn't exist, on a property whose owner has been nothing but transparent with my own team for 6 months. Diane said. The crowd around her had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of people watching something real happen instead of something rehearsed. You're done, Carter. I'll have the board notified by end of day. She ended the call. The lot was silent except for a delivery truck idling somewhere behind the diner. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. That took more nerve than I expected, he said. Most people in your position handle that kind of thing behind a closed door. Most of what's been done in my company's name lately has been handled behind closed doors, Diane said. I'm done with that, apparently as of about 90 seconds ago. Stay with me, because what Diane does next minus what she chooses to build instead of simply walking away minus is the part of this story that earns everything that's come before it. The inspector, given the public reversal and the absence of any actual executive authorization on file, withdrew the citation on the spot. Noting in his own report that the complaint appeared to have been filed without proper sign-off. The crowd dispersed slowly, the way crowds do after something unexpectedly real has happened in front of them. Several of them stopping to shake Marcus's hand, or pat his shoulder on their way back to whatever they'd been doing before a city vehicle pulled into the lot. Diane stayed. She sat down on an overturned plastic crate outside the hardware supply, which was not a piece of furniture she had ever once sat on in 6 years of acquisitions, and Marcus, after a moment, sat down on the tailgate of his truck across from her, Ellie settling beside him. I came here to buy your lot out from under 11 businesses, because the math looked clean on a spreadsheet, Diane said. I didn't ask what was actually holding any of it together. I'm asking now. What would it take for me to walk away from this acquisition permanently, and for Whitfield Regional to be the company that protects this strip instead of the company that almost destroyed it? Marcus studied her for a long moment, the way you study someone deciding whether an offer is real or just another tactic. You don't need to buy anything for that, he said. You just need to actually stop trying. I can do more than stop, Diane said. I have resources you don't. I could fund the drainage work, the inspector flagged. Even though we both know it was manufactured minus, it's not actually wrong that the lot's old. I could put it in writing, publicly, that Whitfield Regional won't pursue this parcel again, ever under any future leadership. I could make sure no one in my company gets to quietly do what Carter just did to anyone else. Ever again. Ellie, who had been listening with the same unhurried attention she'd brought to the whole morning, looked up at her father. Are you going to say yes? She asked. The way kids ask questions, adults have been circling for several sentences longer than necessary. Marcus almost smiled at that. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Stay with me, because the version of this parking lot minus and this city block minus that exists 6 months later, is the part of this story that makes all of it worth it. 6 months after that Friday, the strip's drainage had been redone properly, funded entirely by Whitfield Regional under a public agreement that named no acquisition rights attached to the funding, a clause Diane had insisted her own counsel write in language so airtight that no future executive could quietly reinterpret it the way Carter had reinterpreted standard process. Carter Voss did not survive the following board meeting. The same documentation that exposed his manufactured zoning complaint surfaced a pattern of similar tactics on 3 other parcels over the previous 2 years, each one now under internal review. Diane visits the strip twice a year now, never announced, usually buying something small and unnecessary from each shop on the way through minus a spool of thread from Rosa she doesn't need. A slice of pie from the diner she eats standing at the counter. She started keeping a single framed photo in her own office, of the parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday, hand-lettered signs and all. The kind of unremarkable image that would have meant nothing to her 6 months earlier, and now sits exactly at her eye line behind her desk, where the spreadsheet used to be the first thing she saw every morning. Marcus still parks the same truck crooked across 2 spaces most mornings, because the lot is his and the truck has earned the grace, same as it always had. Ellie has taken to telling people, with the specific pride of a 10-year-old who has decided a fact about her family is the most interesting fact available, that her dad once made a billionaire apologize in a parking lot, and that the billionaire still comes back sometimes, and that she's pretty sure that makes them friends now, even though neither adult has used that word out loud yet. This story was never really about a parking lot or a truck. It was about what happens when we let a balance sheet tell us everything we think we need to know about what something is worth, and what it costs the people actually holding a place together, when we're wrong. Marcus lost a wife and nearly lost a business before he learned exactly what he was willing to protect, and exactly how quietly he was willing to do it. He didn't need anyone's permission to be right about that. He just needed someone, eventually willing to stand in his parking lot long enough to actually look. If you've ever watched someone misjudge a person by what they drove or what they owned, only to be proven wrong in front of everyone, tell us about it in the comments below. Those moments deserve to be remembered. And if this one reached you today, leave a like. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one.